He rescued her from the noose when death was 3 heartbeats away. He was Cheyenne, a warrior they called wild, untamed, savage, but she would come to call him beloved. This is the story of how love bloomed in the shadow of the gallows, how 2 worlds collided on a dusty frontier morning, and how one woman's courage to teach and one man's courage to save changed the fate of an entire territory forever. The October dawn of 1874 broke cold and merciless over Dustbrook, Colorado territory. The wooden platform stood like a monument to fear in the center of the town square, its shadow stretching long and dark across the packed dirt. Isadora Wilde, 22 years old with...
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Raven black hair that caught the morning light like silk, stood with her hands bound behind her back, her emerald eyes scanning the crowd that had gathered to watch her die. She wore a simple blue dress, now dusty from her night in the jail cell, and scuffed leather boots that had carried her from Boston to this godforsaken frontier town 6 months ago. Around her neck hung a small silver locket, the only thing of value she owned, containing a photograph of her parents who had died in a carriage accident 3 years prior. Her chin was raised in defiance, though her heart hammered against her. Ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom, the crowd below murmured with anticipation. Ranchers who had never learned to write their own names, shopkeepers who counted on their fingers, and women who whispered prayers while secretly thirsting for the spectacle. They had come to witness the execution of the schoolteacher who had dared to challenge their ignorance, who had committed the unforgivable sin of treating all children as equals, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Sheriff Marcus Brennan, a thick-set man with tobacco-stained teeth and a badge that gleamed like a mockery of justice, stepped forward with the death warrant. His voice carried across the square like the toll of a funeral bell. "Isadora Wilde," he announced, "you stand condemned for the crime of inciting rebellion, corrupting the natural order, and teaching dangerous ideas to the children of this community. May God have mercy on your soul," he finished, though his tone suggested he hoped for no such mercy. The accusations had been swift and merciless. It started when Izzy, as the children called her, began teaching the mixed-race children alongside the white ones in her small schoolhouse on the edge of town. She taught them all to read from the same books, to write their names with the same care, to dream of futures that seemed impossible in this harsh land. But it was her friendship with the Cheyenne children from the nearby reservation that sealed her fate. Little Mary Crowfeather, barely 8 years old, had wandered into town looking for her missing brother. Instead of being turned away like most Indian children, she found herself welcomed into Izzy's classroom. The teacher had knelt to Mary's level, spoken to her in the few Cheyenne words she had learned, and invited her to stay for the afternoon lesson. Word spread like wildfire through the close-knit community of bigots and fearmongers. "She's teaching them to read." Mrs. Abigail Thornton had shrieked at the town meeting 3 weeks ago, her face red with indignation. "Teaching them that they're equal to our children. Next thing you know, they'll be demanding to vote, to own property, to marry our daughters." The hysteria had grown like a cancer. Parents pulled their children from the school. The town council demanded her resignation. But Izzy stood firm, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed the angry mob. "Education is not a privilege to be rationed based on the color of one's skin," she had declared. "Every child, regardless of their heritage, deserves the chance to learn, to grow, to become more than what this world expects of them." Her words had been twisted into evidence of her guilt. By the time the trial began, she was painted as a dangerous radical who threatened the very fabric of civilized society. The judge, a man who could barely read the law books he pretended to understand, sentenced her to death with the cold efficiency of someone disposing of unwanted trash. But what truly condemned her was the letter they found in her possession, written in her own hand to her deceased parents. In it, she had written, "I see such beauty in these children, white and Indian alike. They have the same capacity for wonder, for learning, for love. If only the adults could see what I see, perhaps this world might become a place where all children can flourish side by side." The prosecution had presented this letter as evidence of her seditious intentions, proof that she sought to undermine the natural order established by God and enforced by civilized men. What they saw as dangerous radicalism, she saw as simple human decency. The gap between their worldviews was as vast as the prairie itself. Hangman, a god figure known only as Ezekiel, approached with the noose. His hands were steady, practiced, as he adjusted the rope with the expertise of someone who had ended many lives. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a mixture of morbid fascination and righteous satisfaction. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to get a better view, their innocence corrupted by the adults who should have protected them from such horrors. "Any last words?" Sheriff Brennan asked, though his tone suggested he hoped she would remain. Silent Izzy looked out at the sea of faces, some she recognized from her months in Dustbrook. There was Tommy Henderson, barely 10 years old, who had struggled with his letters until she patiently worked with him every afternoon. His mother now glared at her with hatred, as if Izzy's kindness to her son had somehow tainted him. There was Rebecca Martinez, a mixed-race girl who had blossomed under Izzy's encouragement, her face now streaked with tears as she watched her teacher prepare to die. "I am proud of what I've done," Izzy said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I taught children to read, to think, to dream. I showed them that knowledge is not the enemy of faith, but its greatest ally. I treated every child as a precious gift, regardless of their heritage. If this is my crime, then I die knowing that love and education will outlive the hatred that condemns me today." The crowd stirred uneasily. Some faces showed doubt, others hardened with renewed conviction. But in the back, near the saloon, a group of men nodded approvingly. These were the ones who had secretly supported her work, who had seen the positive changes in their children, but who lacked the courage to speak up when it mattered most. Ezekiel placed the noose around her neck, the rough rope scratching against her delicate skin. The crowd fell silent, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Sheriff Brennan raised his hand to signal the execution. The trapdoor mechanism creaked ominously beneath her feet. This was it. The moment between life and death, between hope and despair. Izzy closed her eyes and thought of her students, of little Mary Crow Feather's bright smile, of the way Tommy Henderson's face had lit up when he finally read his first complete sentence. If she was going to die, she would die with thoughts of love and learning filling her mind. The sheriff's hand began to fall, signaling the hangman to spring the trap. 3 heartbeats remained between Izzy and eternity. 2 heartbeats. 1 heartbeat, the arrow came from nowhere, slicing through the morning air with deadly precision. It struck the rope just above Izzy's head, severing the noose cleanly and sending it tumbling to the platform below. The crowd gasped, some screaming in terror, others spinning around frantically to locate the source of the shot. A second arrow followed immediately, this one pinning Sheriff Brennan's coat to the wooden post behind him. The sheriff's face went white as he realized how close the arrow had come to his heart. A third arrow landed at the base of the platform, its shaft quivering with the force of impact. A single eagle feather tied to its fletching from the hills. Surrounding Dustbrook, a figure emerged like a ghost materializing from the morning mist. He rode a magnificent paint horse, its coat marked with the sacred symbols of the Cheyenne people. The rider himself was tall and lean, with long black hair that flowed like water down his back, adorned with beads and feathers that caught the
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
sunlight. His face was painted with the traditional markings of a warrior. but his eyes held an intelligence that spoke of both fierce courage and deep wisdom. He wore buckskin leggings and a vest decorated with intricate beadwork, and his arms were marked with the tattoos that told the story of his deeds and his vision quests. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and turquoise, and in his hands he held a bow carved from the finest wood, its string singing with the tension of a drawn arrow. This was Kohana Nightwind, whose name meant swift in the language of his people. He was known throughout the territory as a warrior who could move like shadow through any terrain, who could track a whisper across stone, who could shoot an arrow with the precision of divine judgment. The white settlers called him wild, untamed, dangerous. But to his people, he was a protector, a guardian of the sacred ways, a bridge between the world of the spirits and the world of men. He sat motionless on his horse for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in the scene before him. The crowd below shifted nervously, unsure whether to run or fight. Sheriff Brennan fumbled for his gun, but the arrow through his coat held him pinned like a butterfly in a collector's display. "Let her go," Kohana said, his voice carrying across the square with the authority of thunder. He spoke English clearly, though his accent carried the musical cadence of his native tongue. "She has done no crime that deserves death. This is none of your concern, Indian." Sheriff Brennan shouted, his voice cracking with fear and bluster. "This woman is a criminal, condemned by the law of civilized men." Kohana's expression didn't change, but his grip on his bow tightened. "Your law is not justice. Your civilization is not wisdom. And your fear is not strength." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. The crowd held its collective breath, caught between the drama of the interrupted execution and the primal fear of the Cheyenne warrior who had dared to challenge their authority. Some men reached for their guns, but hesitated when they saw the deadly accuracy with which Kohana had placed his arrows. Izzy stood on the platform, her hands still bound, the severed noose lying at her feet like a dead snake. She looked up at the warrior on the hill, this man who had risked everything to save a stranger, and felt something stir in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. There was something in his eyes, a depth of understanding that spoke to her very soul. "Choose," Kohana said, his voice directed at her now. "Live as a free woman, or die as their prisoner. But choose quickly." The simplicity of the choice cut through all the complexity of her situation. Life or death. Freedom or bondage, hope or despair. "I choose life," she called out, her voice ringing with newfound determination. "I choose freedom." What happened next would be talked about in Dustbrook for generations. Kohana spurred his horse forward, racing down the hill with the speed of the wind itself. His war cry echoed across the valley, a sound that spoke of ancient battles and timeless courage. The crowd scattered like leaves before a storm, some running for cover, others diving beneath wagons and into doorways. Sheriff Brennan finally freed himself from the arrow and drew his gun, but Kohana was already upon him. With a movement so fluid, it seemed like a dance, the warrior leaped from his horse onto the platform. His knife flashed in the morning sun as he cut Izzy's bonds, and before anyone could react, he had swept her up in his arms and leaped back onto his horse. The entire rescue took less than 30 seconds. By the time the sheriff's men gathered their wits enough to shoot, Kohana and Izzy were already racing out of town, disappearing into the maze of canyons and mesas that stretched toward the horizon. Like a path to another world, the horses' hooves thundered across the hard-packed earth, carrying them away from Dustbrook and toward the vast wilderness that stretched beyond the reach of civilized law. Izzy clung to Kohana's waist, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Behind them, she could hear the sounds of pursuit, horses whinnying, men shouting, the crack of gunfire that echoed off the canyon walls. But Kohana knew these lands like he knew his own heartbeat. He guided his horse through narrow passages, between towering red rocks, across streams that would hide their tracks, up steep trails that would challenge any pursuer. He rode with the confidence of someone who had been born to this landscape, who understood its rhythms and its secrets. "Where are we going?" Izzy called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "To safety," Kohana replied, his voice steady. "Despite the pace of their flight, to my people. To a place where your kind of courage is valued, not condemned." They rode for hours, the landscape changing around them like pages in a book. The scrubland gave way to pine forests, which opened onto high meadows where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying the scent of sage and snow and something else, the smell of freedom itself. As the sun reached its zenith, they paused beside a crystal-clear stream to rest the horse and drink. Izzy slid down from the saddle, her legs shaky from the long ride, and knelt beside the water. She cupped the cold liquid in her hands and drank deeply, tasting the purity of the mountain source. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Kohana as he watered his horse. "You saved my life." He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "You were willing to die for what you believed in. That is not a common thing among your people." "It's not common among any people," Izzy replied. "But some things are worth dying for. Teaching children, fighting ignorance, showing kindness to those who are different. These things matter more than my own life." Kohana nodded slowly. "My grandmother had a vision 3 nights ago. She saw a woman with dark hair and green eyes, a teacher who would bring knowledge to our children. She said this woman would be in great danger, and that the spirits would guide us to her." Izzy felt a chill run down her spine. "Your grandmother saw me in a vision?" "She sees many things that others cannot. She said this woman would be marked by sorrow but strengthened by love. She said she would be a bridge between 2 worlds, a teacher who would help our peoples understand each other." The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket. She had come west to escape her past, to find a new life in a new land. But perhaps she had been called here for a greater purpose, one that she was only beginning to understand. "What happens now?" she asked. Kohana remounted his horse and extended his hand to her. "Now we ride to my village. Now you meet my people. Now you discover what it means to be truly free." As they resumed their journey, Izzy felt a strange sense of destiny settling over her. Behind them lay the world of fear and hatred that had condemned her to death. Ahead lay an uncertain future with people she had never met, in a culture she barely understood. But for the first time in months, she felt hope blooming in her chest like a flower reaching toward the sun. The afternoon shadows were growing long when they finally stopped to rest in a hidden canyon where ancient petroglyphs decorated the red stone walls. Kohana built a small fire and shared dried meat and berries from his travel pack. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people from different worlds who had found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. "Why did you risk everything to save me?" Izzy asked as the fire crackled between them. Kohana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "My mother was killed by white soldiers when I was 12 years old. She was a teacher, like you. She taught our children the old ways, the sacred stories, the healing arts. The soldiers said she was a threat to their civilized order. They said she was filling young minds with dangerous ideas." Izzy's heart clenched with understanding. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine the pain you've carried. For many years, I hated all white people. I thought they were all the same, ignorant, cruel, afraid of anything different. But my grandmother taught me that hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it. She said that someday I would meet a white person who would show me that not all of your people are the same." He looked at her across the fire, and in his eyes she saw not just the warrior who had saved her, but the man who had chosen to risk everything for a stranger. "When I saw you on that platform, willing to die for the children you had taught, I knew you were the one my grandmother had spoken of. I knew that you were worth saving. And now?" Izzy asked softly. Now I believe that perhaps our peoples can learn to live together in peace. That perhaps understanding can triumph over fear. That perhaps love can build bridges where hatred has built walls. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear, distant lights that seemed to promise that even in the darkest night, there was always hope. What will your people think of me? Izzy asked. Kohana smiled, and for the first time since he had rescued her, she saw warmth in his expression. They will think that the spirits work in mysterious ways. They will think that perhaps the teacher my grandmother saw in her vision has finally come home. As they prepared to rest for the night, Izzy felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She had lost everything, her job, her home, her old life, but she had gained something precious in return. She had found a man who saw her not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a gift to be cherished. She had found a purpose that went beyond her own survival. Tomorrow they would reach his village. Tomorrow she would meet his people and discover what the future held. But tonight, under the vast western sky, she felt more alive than she had in years. Tonight, she was not just Isadora Wilde, the condemned schoolteacher. She was a woman who had been given a second chance at life, and she was determined to make the most of it. The fire died down to glowing embers, and the canyon fell silent except for the distant call of a night bird. In the darkness, two hearts that had been strangers that morning began to beat in rhythm, and the first seeds of a love that would change everything were planted in the fertile soil of shared courage and mutual respect. The morning mist clung to the canyon walls like the breath of ancient spirits as Izzy woke to the sound of rushing water and the gentle crackle of a rekindled fire. Kohana was already awake, his silhouette outlined against the brightening sky as he performed what she would later learn was his morning ritual of gratitude to the four directions. His voice carried softly in the Cheyenne language, a melodic prayer that seemed to harmonize with the very heartbeat of the earth itself. She watched him with fascination, noting the reverence in his movements, the way he held himself with quiet dignity even in this simple act of devotion. This was not the savage warrior that the people of Dustbrook had feared, but a man of deep spiritual conviction whose connection to the natural world ran as deep as the roots of the ancient cottonwoods that lined the stream. When he finished his prayers, Kohana turned to find her watching him. Instead of embarrassment or irritation at her curiosity, his expression held only gentle amusement. "You sleep like a stone," he said, his voice carrying the hint of a smile. "The coyotes sang all night, and you never stirred." "I haven't slept that peacefully in months," Izzy admitted, sitting up and stretching muscles that ached from the previous day's ride. "I think it's the first time since I arrived in Colorado that I felt truly safe." Kohana nodded as he handed her a cup of herbal tea brewed from plants she didn't recognize. The liquid was warm and fragrant, with a slightly bitter taste that seemed to awaken her senses and clear her mind. "This is what my grandmother calls morning courage," he explained. "It prepares the spirit for whatever the day may bring." As they shared a simple breakfast of dried meat, berries, and something that tasted like a cross between bread and jerky, Izzy found herself studying her rescuer with new eyes. In the harsh light of the execution platform, she had seen only a fierce warrior willing to risk everything for a stranger. But in the gentle morning light, she saw the man beneath the legend, someone who moved with quiet grace, who spoke with thoughtful consideration, who seemed to carry within him a wisdom that came from sources far older than books or formal education. "Tell me about your grandmother," she said, genuinely curious about the woman who had seen her in a vision. What kind of person has dreams that can change the course of someone's life? Kohana's expression grew soft with affection. "Ayana Wind Whisper has been the spiritual guide of our people for more than 40 years. She speaks with the voices of the ancestors, interprets the signs that the spirits send, and helps our people understand their place in the great web of existence. When she was young, she was taken by white soldiers like my mother would be years Later, but she returned? She escaped after 3 years in their boarding school, where they tried to beat the Indian out of her. She came home speaking their language, understanding their ways, but with her spirit intact. She said the spirits had sent her to learn their secrets, so that our people could survive in a world that was changing too fast for the old ways alone. The weight of this revelation settled over Izzy like a blanket. She was beginning to understand that her rescue was part of something larger than a simple act of heroism. She was a piece in a puzzle that had been decades in the making, part of a vision that extended far beyond her own immediate circumstances. Their peaceful morning was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Kohana was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his bow with the fluid grace of a predator responding to threat. The sound grew closer, and with it came the harsh voices of men, driven by anger and the promise of reward. "How many?" Izzy whispered, her heart beginning to race with familiar fear. Kohana tilted his head, listening with the practiced ear of someone who had survived by reading the subtlest signs of danger. 8 men, maybe 10. They're pushing their horses hard, but they don't know the land. They're following the stream because it's the only trail they can read. He moved swiftly to break camp, scattering the ashes of their fire and erasing any sign of their presence with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before they reach this place," he said, securing their supplies on his horse. "But they're not the real danger." "What do you mean?" "These men are loud, clumsy, easy to evade. But Sheriff Brennan is not stupid. He'll have sent another group to circle around through the high passes, and they'll have a tracker with them, someone who knows these lands almost as well as I do." The implications hit Izzy like a physical blow. They weren't just running from a posse of angry townspeople. They were being hunted by men who understood the territory, who could read sign and anticipate their movements. "What do we do?" Kohana's smile was sharp as a blade. "We do something they won't expect. We go up instead of down, into the sacred lands where white men fear to tread. The spirits will protect us there, and their tracker will refuse to follow." He helped her mount behind him, and they began to climb a narrow trail that seemed to lead straight up the canyon wall. The path was barely wide enough for the horse, with sheer rock on one side and empty air on the other. Izzy closed her eyes and pressed her face against Kohana's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the sure movements of his body as he guided them upward. Behind them, voices grew louder, more urgent. She could hear individual words now, curses, threats, the kind of language that men use when they're frustrated and afraid. But the sounds were growing fainter as they climbed, and soon they faded entirely as the canyon walls closed around them. Like protective arms. "They'll never find the trail," Kohana said with quiet satisfaction. "Only my people know these paths, and we've guarded the secret for generations. We're safe now, at least from them." The trail opened suddenly onto a high plateau that took Izzy's breath away. Spread before them was a landscape unlike anything she had ever seen, rolling grasslands dotted with strange rock formations that seemed to have been carved by the hands of giants. The air itself felt different here, charged with an energy that made her skin tingle and her heart race with something that had nothing to do with fear. "This is the threshold," Kohana said, his voice dropping to a whisper of reverence. "Beyond this point, we enter the sacred lands of my people. Here, the spirits of our ancestors still walk, and the old ways still hold power. White men who enter this place without permission find themselves lost, turned around, unable to find their way back to the world they know." Izzy looked around, with new eyes, noting the way the light seemed to shimmer differently here, the way the wind carried sounds that might have been voices or might have been imagination. "Is it real?" she asked. "The protection, I mean. Or is it just superstition?" 3 years ago, a group of soldiers came hunting for a war party that had raided a supply wagon. They followed the trail to this very spot, then turned back. Their sergeant said later that his compass spun like a child's top, that his men began seeing things that weren't there, that the horses refused to go forward. They called it magnetic interference, atmospheric disturbance, whatever words they needed to explain what they couldn't understand. He guided the horse forward, and Izzy felt a strange sensation as they crossed some invisible boundary. The air grew warmer despite the altitude, and she could swear she heard distant drums beating in rhythm with her own heartbeat. "But you know the truth," she said. "I know that this land remembers," Kohana replied. "Every prayer spoken here, every ceremony performed, every ancestor who walked these paths, their spirits are woven into the very fabric of this place. It recognizes those who come with respect and turns away those who come with violence in their hearts. They rode deeper into the sacred territory, following paths that seemed to shift and change even as they traveled them." Izzy began to notice details that defied rational explanation: rock formations that looked like giant animals, springs that bubbled up from solid stone, trees that grew in perfect circles around sites that hummed with invisible energy. "My grandmother will want to meet you soon," Kohana said as they paused beside a spring that reflected the sky like a mirror. "But first, you must understand what it means to be here. This is not just a place of refuge, it's a place of transformation. People who enter the sacred lands do not leave unchanged. What kind of change? That depends on what the spirits see in your heart. Some people discover strengths they never knew they had. Others learn truths about themselves that they've spent their lives avoiding. A few find their calling, their true purpose in the great web of existence." Izzy felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "And what do you think they'll see in me?" Kohana's dark eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "I think they already know exactly who you are. I think that's why my grandmother's vision brought us together." The village appeared gradually, as if the landscape itself was revealing its secrets one layer at a time. First came the smell of wood smoke and cooking food, then the sound of children laughing and dogs barking, and finally the sight of the settlement itself, a collection of traditional teepees and more permanent structures, arranged in a great circle around a central fire pit that seemed to burn with flames that never died. The people who emerged to greet them were nothing like the savage warriors that Izzy had been taught to fear. These were families, mothers with babies, elderly men with kind eyes, children who ran alongside their horse with curious expressions and delighted giggles. They were dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and practical items acquired through trade, their faces painted with designs that spoke of individual identity and tribal affiliation. "They're beautiful," Izzy whispered, and she meant it. There was something about these people that radiated peace and contentment, a sense of belonging that she had never experienced in the so-called civilized world she had left behind. "They're wondering about you," Kohana said with amusement. "It's been many years since a white woman entered our village, and never one who came as a friend rather than a captive." A group of warriors approached, their expressions serious but not hostile. They spoke to Kohana in rapid Cheyenne, and Izzy caught enough of the conversation to understand that they were reporting on the pursuit, the success of their diversion tactics, and the current safety of the village. These men treated Kohana with obvious respect, but there was also an easy familiarity that spoke of long friendship and shared hardship. "The danger is past," Kohana told her as they dismounted. "The posse turned back hours ago, and the tracker refused to enter the sacred lands. We're safe here." But even as he spoke, Izzy noticed the way some of the villagers held back, their expressions guarded and uncertain. Not everyone was pleased to see a white woman in their midst, and she could hardly blame them. Her people had brought nothing but death and destruction to theirs, and trust would have to be earned one gesture at a time. A young woman approached them, her face painted with intricate designs that marked her as someone of importance. She was perhaps Izzy's age, with long black hair braided with feathers and beads. and eyes that held both intelligence and wariness. "I am Nayeli Brightstar," she said in accented English. "I speak for the women of this village. We would know why you have brought this white woman among us." "I have brought a teacher," Kohana replied formally. "One who was willing to die rather than abandon the children she had promised to protect. My grandmother's vision spoke of such a woman, and the spirits guided me to her." Nayeli's gaze shifted to Izzy, studying her with the kind of intense scrutiny that seemed to look past surface appearances to something deeper. "You are the one who taught Indian children alongside white ones, who faced the rope rather than deny them their right to learn." "I am," Izzy said simply. "And I would do it again, if necessary." The young woman's expression softened slightly. "Then you are welcome in our village, teacher. But know that here, you will be the student as well as the instructor. Our children will teach you things that no white school ever could." Ayana Windwhisper was ancient beyond measure, her face lined with the kind of deep wrinkles that spoke of countless seasons of laughter and sorrow. She sat in the place of honor beside the central fire, wrapped in a buffalo robe decorated with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the dancing light of the flames. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a clarity that made Izzy feel as though she was being seen truly for the first time in her life. "Granddaughter," the old woman said, though she spoke in English for Izzy's benefit, "you have traveled far to reach us. Sit, and let me see if you are indeed the one the spirits showed me." Izzy approached hesitantly, unsure of the proper protocol for meeting a person of such obvious spiritual authority. But Ayana's smile was warm and welcoming, and she patted the ground beside her with a gesture that transcended cultural boundaries. "Give me your hands," the old woman commanded gently. When Izzy complied, Ayana closed her eyes and held them for a long moment, her breathing becoming slow and deep. The entire village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict of their spiritual guide. "Yes," Ayana said finally, opening her eyes and nodding with satisfaction. "You carry the mark of the teacher spirit, but also the scar of great loss. Your heart has been broken by the cruelty of others, but not hardened by it. You seek to heal the world's ignorance with knowledge, to bridge the gap between peoples." With understanding, Izzy felt tears pricking her eyes. This stranger had seen more of her true nature in a few moments than most people did in years of acquaintance. "How do you know all this?" "The spirits speak to those who know how to listen," Ayana replied. "But more than that, I see the way you look at our children with the same love and hope that you showed to your own students. I see the way you hold yourself proud but not arrogant, strong but not rigid. Most importantly, I see the way my grandson looks at you." Izzy's cheeks burned with sudden embarrassment. "I don't understand. Don't you?" Ayana's laugh was like the sound of wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Love is the most powerful force in the universe, child. It can cross any boundary, heal any wound, bridge any divide. The spirits brought you to us, not just as a teacher, but as the woman who would complete my grandson's heart." The old woman's words hung in the air like smoke from sacred herbs. Around the fire, the other villagers watched with knowing smiles, as if they had seen something that Izzy was only beginning to understand. She looked across the flames to where Kohana sat with the other warriors, and their eyes met with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But first," Ayana continued, "you must prove that you are worthy of the gifts the spirits would give you. Tomorrow you will begin your true education. You will learn our ways, our language, our understanding of the world. You will discover strengths you never knew you had, and face truths about yourself that you've been avoiding. What if I fail? Then you will try again and again until you succeed. The spirits do not give up on those they have chosen, and neither do we. But I do not think you will fail, granddaughter. I think you will surprise us all, including yourself." The test came without warning, as the best tests always do. Izzy was helping the women prepare the evening meal when a cry of alarm rang through the village. A child had fallen into the central fire pit, and his clothing was ablaze. The boy's mother screamed in terror as others rushed to help, but they were too far away. Without thinking, Izzy threw herself forward, rolling the child away from the flames and smothering the fire with her own body. The heat seared her hands and arms, but she ignored the pain, focusing only on the terrified child in her arms. "It's all right," she whispered in what little Cheyenne she knew. "You're safe now." The village erupted in controlled chaos as the healer was summoned and the boy was rushed to the medicine lodge. But even as they worked to treat his burns, Izzy found herself surrounded by warriors who had drawn their weapons. She looked up in confusion, her own burned hands cradled against her chest. "You used fire medicine," one of the warriors accused. "Only those trained in the sacred arts may call upon the spirits in such a way." "I don't understand," Izzy said, her voice weak with pain and exhaustion. "I just tried to help." Kohana appeared at her side, his expression fierce with protective anger. "She saved the child's life. Would you punish her for that?" "She used powers that are not hers to command," the warrior replied. "She may have saved the boy's body, but what of his spirit? What of the balance of forces that govern our world?" Ayanna Wind Whisper's voice cut through the argument like a blade. "Bring her to me," the old woman commanded. "And bring the child as well. We will let the spirits themselves judge whether harm has been done." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Izzy had ever experienced. The entire village gathered around the central fire as Ayanna began to chant in the ancient language, her voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the earth. Sacred herbs were burned, prayers were offered, and the spirits of the ancestors were called upon to witness and judge. When the chanting stopped, the silence was so profound that Izzy could hear her own heartbeat. Then slowly the injured child opened his eyes. His burns were healing with impossible speed, and his face was filled with a peaceful contentment that spoke of divine intervention. "The spirits have spoken," Ayanna announced. "This woman carries the gift of healing, but she has always possessed it. Today, she simply allowed it to flow through her for the first time. The child is not only healed, but blessed. He will grow to be a great medicine man, a bridge between the old ways and the new." The crowd murmured in amazement and approval. The warrior who had challenged Izzy knelt before her, his head bowed in respect. "Forgive me, medicine woman. I did not recognize your power. I'm not a medicine woman," Izzy protested, but Ayanna silenced her with a gesture. "You are what the spirits say you are," the old woman replied. "And they say you are a healer, a teacher, and a bridge between worlds. Tomorrow your real education begins. Tonight, you rest and allow your own wounds to heal." As the ceremony concluded and the villagers dispersed, Kohana approached Izzy with a mixture of pride and concern. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly. "First you show the courage to face death for your beliefs, and now you reveal powers that even you didn't know you possessed." "I don't understand what happened," Izzy admitted. "I just saw a child in danger, and I acted without thinking. That is exactly what a true healer does," Kohana replied. "She acts from the heart, not from the head. She trusts in powers greater than herself, and she allows love to guide her actions." He took her burned hands in his own, and she felt a strange tingling sensation as his touch seemed to draw the pain away. "Rest now," he said gently. "Tomorrow you begin to discover who you truly are. Tonight you are safe, you are valued, and you are home." As Izzy lay in the lodge that had been prepared for her, listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep around her, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this place. 24 hours ago, she had been a condemned woman waiting to die. Now she was being called a medicine woman by people who understood such things far better than she did. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that her rescue had been about more than just saving her life. It had been about bringing her to a place where she could finally discover her true purpose, her real calling. And as she drifted off to sleep, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever spirits had guided her path to this moment of transformation. 3 weeks had passed since the fire ceremony, and Izzy's world had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The burns on her hands had healed without leaving scars, but more importantly, she had begun to understand the strange abilities that had manifested during the child's rescue. Under Ayana's patient guidance, she was learning to harness powers that seemed to flow from the very earth itself. Each morning began with meditation beside the sacred spring, where the old woman taught her to quiet her Western mind and open herself to the subtle energies that surrounded them. "Your people think too much," Ayana would say with gentle amusement. "They use their heads to solve problems that can only be understood with the heart." This morning was different. As Izzy knelt beside the spring, following the breathing patterns Ayana had taught her, she felt something shift inside her consciousness. The world around her seemed to come alive with colors she had never seen before, golden threads of energy connecting every living thing, silver streams of power flowing through the earth, and pulsing nodes of light that marked places where the spirit world touched the physical realm. "You're beginning to see," Ayana said softly, her voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The veil between worlds grows thin for those who know how to look." Izzy opened her eyes, and for a moment, the vision persisted. She could see the web of energy that connected her to the old woman, to the trees, to the very stones beneath her feet. Then, gradually the ordinary world reasserted itself, but something fundamental had changed. She would never again see the world as a collection of separate objects. Now she understood that everything was connected, part of one great living system. "What's happening to me?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder and a touch of fear. "You're remembering what you always knew but forgot," Ayana replied. "All children are born with the sight, but your people teach them to ignore it, to trust only what they can measure and weigh. We teach our children to honor both worlds, the one they can touch and the one they can feel." The old woman stood and beckoned Izzy to follow her toward the village center, where the morning's activities were already beginning. "Today you will face your first real test as a medicine woman. A rider came in the night with news that will challenge everything you've learned." The messenger was a young Cheyenne warrior named Lakota, his face streaked with dust and exhaustion from a hard ride. He had collapsed near the village entrance just before dawn, his horse foam-flecked and trembling. Now as the sun climbed higher, he delivered news that sent shockwaves through the peaceful settlement. "The soldiers are coming," he gasped, accepting the cup of water from Nayeli with shaking hands. 3 days' ride from here, maybe less. They have orders to round up all the tribes in the territory and move them to the reservation in Oklahoma. The village erupted in controlled chaos as the implications of his words sank in. This was not just another raid or minor conflict. This was the beginning of forced relocation, the systematic destruction of their way of life. Families began gathering their most precious possessions. Warriors checked their weapons, and the elders huddled in urgent council. "How many soldiers?" Kohana asked, his warriors' training taking over despite the obvious pain in his eyes. 200, maybe more. They have artillery, supply wagons, and a colonel who's known for his hatred of our people. Colonel Marcus Steele, he's the one who destroyed the Lakota village at Wounded Creek last year. Izzy felt her blood run cold. She had heard stories of Steele's brutality, his policy of showing no mercy to any tribe that resisted relocation. He was the kind of man who saw Indians as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be reasoned with. "We have to run," someone said, and others began to nod in agreement. "Take the children and the elders. Disappear into the deep mountains. Until this passes, it won't pass," Dakota said wearily. "This is different. They mean to clear the entire territory, to make it safe for white settlement. There's nowhere to run that they won't eventually follow." Ayana's voice cut through the growing despair like a blade. Then we don't run, we fight. But not with bullets and arrows, we fight with something far more powerful. All eyes turned to the ancient woman, who stood with her back straight and her clouded eyes blazing with inner fire. We fight with the truth. We show them that we are not savages to be driven from our lands, but people with wisdom, with healing, with gifts that the world needs. How? Nayeli asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ayana's gaze fell on Izzy, and suddenly the young woman understood. You want me to go to them? To try to reason with this Colonel Steele. I want you to show them what you've learned here. To demonstrate that the gap between our peoples can be bridged. That understanding is possible even in the darkest times. The suggestion was met with immediate and vehement opposition. It's suicide, Kohana said flatly. They'll kill her on sight, or worse. They might, Ayana agreed calmly. But they might also listen. She's white. She speaks their language. She understands their ways. If anyone can reach them, it's her. The debate raged for hours. But in the end, it was Izzy herself who made the decision. She had spent weeks learning about the interconnectedness of all things, about the responsibility that came with power, about the courage required to stand for what was right. This was her moment to put that knowledge into practice. I'll go, she said quietly, and the argument ceased. But not alone, and not unprepared. If I'm going to face this Colonel Steele, I need to understand exactly what I'm walking into. Kohana was beside her instantly, his face grim with determination. Then I'm coming with you. No, Izzy said firmly. You're a wanted man, remember? Your presence would only make things worse. But there is something you can do for me. Over the next 2 days, the village transformed into a hive of activity as they prepared for what everyone knew might be their last stand. Izzy worked with Ayana to create a special medicine bundle, a collection of herbs, crystals, and sacred objects that would help her maintain her connection to the spirit world, even in the face of overwhelming hostility. Remember, the old woman said as she wrapped the bundle in deer hide, you are not just Izzy Wild anymore. You are a bridge between worlds, a healer who carries the wisdom of two peoples. When you speak to these soldiers, you speak with the voice of the earth itself. Nayeli contributed a doeskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, each pattern telling a story of the Cheyenne people's history and values. Wear this, she sighed. Let them see that we are artists, creators, people of beauty and culture. The warriors, led by Kohana, spent hours teaching Izzy the finer points of military strategy and negotiation. Steele is a career soldier, Kohana explained as they studied maps around the central fire. He thinks in terms of objectives and obstacles. If you can convince him that cooperation serves his goals better than conflict, you might have a chance. And if I can't, then you get out of there as fast as you can and let us handle things the old way. But the most important preparation was spiritual. Each night, Izzy joined Ayana in the sweat lodge, where the intense heat and sacred smoke helped her achieve deeper states of consciousness. In these altered states, she began to understand the true nature of her mission. You're not just trying to save this village, Ayana explained as they sat in the steaming darkness. You're trying to change the course of history itself. The spirits have chosen you to be a catalyst, a force for transformation in a world that's forgotten how to see past the surface of things. What if I'm not strong enough? Strength doesn't come from the body or even the mind, the old woman replied. It comes from connection to the earth, to the spirits, to the web of life that binds all things together. You've learned to tap into that connection. Now you must trust it completely. The cavalry column was impressive in its military precision, 200 soldiers in perfect formation, their uniforms immaculate despite days of travel, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. At their head rode Colonel Marcus Steele, a man whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him both feared and respected throughout the frontier. Izzy rode out to meet them alone, mounted on a gentle mare that Kohana had chosen for her steadiness under pressure. She wore the beaded dress Nayeli had given her, but over it she carried a white flag of truce, and around her neck hung a silver cross symbols that would be recognizable to the approaching soldiers. "Hold," Steele commanded as she approached, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. "State your business. I'm here to talk," Izzy said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "To discuss the situation with the Cheyenne village, to see if we can find a peaceful solution." Steele's cold gray eyes took in her appearance, noting the contrast between her white features and her Indian clothing. "You're the school teacher," he said after a moment, "the one who escaped from Dustbrook. There's still a warrant out for your arrest." "I'm aware of that," Izzy replied, "but I'm hoping we can put aside past grievances in favor of preventing unnecessary bloodshed." Colonel's laugh was harsh and mirthless. "Bloodshed? Miss Wilde, I have orders to relocate every Indian in this territory to the reservation in Oklahoma. Those who comply will be treated with all the consideration due to federal prisoners. Those who resist will be dealt with accordingly. These people aren't criminals," Izzy said, her voice beginning to carry the power that Ayanna had taught her to access. "They're families, elders, children. They've done nothing wrong except live on land that others want. They're obstacles to progress," Steele replied coldly. "Civilization requires order, and order requires that everyone follow the same rules. These savages refuse to adapt to civilized ways, so they must be removed." Izzy felt the familiar stirring of the power within her, the connection to the web of life that bound all things together. But this time, instead of healing energy, she felt something else, a deep, abiding sense of the interconnectedness of all living things. And with it came a kind of authority that transcended military rank or social position. "Colonel," she said, and her voice seemed to carry the weight of mountains, "you're about to make a terrible mistake. These people have knowledge that could benefit your own soldiers, wisdom that could help heal the wounds that war has left on this land. If you destroy them, you'll be destroying something irreplaceable." For a moment, something flickered in Steele's eyes, doubt, perhaps, or recognition of something he had forgotten. But then his military training reasserted itself, and his expression hardened. "You've been living with them too long, Miss Wilde. You've forgotten what civilization means." "I've learned what it could mean," Izzy replied. "A world where different peoples can live together, where knowledge is shared instead of hoarded, where children can grow up without fear of being murdered for the color of their skin. What happened next would be talked about for generations, though few would ever agree on exactly what they had witnessed." As Izzy spoke, her voice began to resonate with harmonics that seemed to come from the earth itself. The morning air grew thick with energy, and sensitive horses began to dance nervously as they felt the change in the atmosphere. "You want proof that these people aren't savages?" Izzy continued, her voice now carrying power that made grown men step back involuntarily. "Let me show you what they've taught me." She reached into her medicine bundle and withdrew a handful of what looked like ordinary dust. But as she scattered it on the ground before the colonel's horse, the particles began to glow with an inner light. Where they touched the earth, flowers bloomed instantaneously, not the hardy prairie grass that belonged there, but exotic blossoms that filled the air with impossible fragrances. The soldiers muttered in amazement and fear, some making the sign of the cross, others reaching for weapons they weren't sure would be effective against whatever power they were witnessing. But Steele held his ground, his jaw set with the determination of a man who refused to be impressed. "Parlor tricks," he said dismissively. "I've seen stage magicians do better. This is no trick," Izzy replied, and now her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "This is the power of life itself, the force that connects all things. Your soldiers are tired, Colonel. They've been riding hard for days, and some of them are sick with the fever that's been plaguing the frontier. Settlements," she gestured toward the ranks of cavalry, and several men looked down in surprise as they realized she was right. They had been feeling unwell, but the demands of military discipline had prevented them from admitting it. "Let me heal them," Izzy said. "Let me show you what cooperation can accomplish." Without waiting for permission, she walked toward the nearest sick soldier, a young private whose face was flushed with fever. She placed her hands on his forehead, and the same golden light that had touched the earth began to flow through her fingers. The change was immediate and undeniable. The soldier's fever broke, his breathing eased, and color returned to his cheeks. He looked up at her with wonder and gratitude, then turned to his colonel with an expression that mixed amazement with something approaching reverence. "Sir," he said quietly, "I feel better than I have in weeks." Other soldiers began to murmur, and Izzy could see the doubt growing in their eyes. These men had been taught to see Indians as enemies, but what they were witnessing challenged everything. They thought they knew about the nature of civilization and savagery. "Enough!" Steele barked, his voice cracking with strain. "I don't care what tricks you've learned from these heathens. I have my orders, and I intend to carry them out." But even as he spoke, Izzy could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The demonstration had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and she pressed her advantage. "Your orders are to relocate the tribes, but they don't specify how. What if there was another way? What if these people were willing to serve as scouts, guides, healers for your army? What if cooperation could achieve your objectives better than force?" The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with 200 soldiers watching their colonel wrestle with a decision that would determine the fate of an entire people. Izzy stood in the center of it all, no longer the terrified schoolteacher who had faced the gallows in Dustbrook, but a woman transformed by her journey into something entirely new. "You're asking me to disobey direct orders," Steele said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of military tradition. "I'm asking you to think beyond orders," Izzy replied. "To consider the possibility that there might be a better way to achieve peace on the frontier than through the systematic destruction of entire cultures." She gestured toward the village, which was visible in the distance as a cluster of smoke, plumes and gleaming teepees. "Those people have survived in this harsh land for generations. They know where to find water in the desert, how to predict weather patterns, which plants can heal and which can kill. They have knowledge that could save the lives of your soldiers and the settlers who will come after them. And in exchange? In exchange, they keep their dignity, their culture, their right to exist as a people. They become partners in the development of this territory rather than obstacles to be removed." Steele was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Izzy to the distant village to the faces of his own men. She could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression, the conflict between duty and conscience, between the harsh realities of military life and the possibility of a different kind of future. "If I were to consider such an arrangement," he said carefully, "what guarantees could you offer that these people wouldn't simply disappear into the wilderness the moment my back is turned?" "You have my word," Izzy said simply. "And more than that, you have the understanding that we're all part of the same web of existence. Hurt one part, and you hurt the whole. Help one part flourish, and all parts benefit." She reached into her medicine bundle one more time and withdrew a small crystal that seemed to pulse with inner light. "This is a gift from the grandmother of the village, the woman who saw my coming in a vision. She wants you to have it as a symbol of the peace we're offering." Steele took the crystal hesitantly, and as his fingers closed around it, his expression changed. For just a moment, the harsh lines of military discipline softened, and Izzy saw something she had never expected to see in the eyes of a career soldier: hope. 3 days, he said finally. "I'll give you 3 days to work out the details of this arrangement. If it doesn't work, if there's any sign of treachery or deception, I'll carry out my original orders without hesitation. 3 days is all we need," Izzy said, relief flooding through her like warm water. "Thank you, Colonel. You won't regret this decision." As the cavalry column made camp a respectful distance from the village, Izzy rode back to bring the news to her adopted people. Behind her, she could hear the soldiers talking among themselves, their voices filled with curiosity and cautious optimism. The demonstration had shaken their preconceptions, and now they were beginning to see the Cheyenne not as enemies to be destroyed, but as potential allies in the great work of building a new kind of civilization. When she reached the village, she found Kohana waiting for her, his face a mixture of pride and amazement. "You did it," he said simply. "You actually did it. We did it," Izzy corrected. "All of us together. But this is just the beginning. Now we have to prove that cooperation really can work, that two peoples can find common ground even after so much hatred and bloodshed." As the sun set over the sacred lands, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Izzy felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over her. She had found her true calling at last, not just as a teacher or a healer, but as a bridge between worlds, a woman who could help different peoples understand that their similarities were stronger than their differences. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the fragile peace they had created. But tonight, under the vast western sky, she allowed herself to believe that love really could triumph over fear, that understanding could conquer hatred, and that the future held possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine. The morning of the first day dawned with intention that seemed to electrify the very air around the Cheyenne village. Izzy stood at the edge of the settlement, watching as small groups of soldiers approached under white flags, their faces a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed suspicion. These men had spent years being told that Indians were nothing more than savage obstacles to civilization, and now they were being asked to see them as potential allies. Colonel Steele had divided his forces into smaller units, each tasked with learning specific skills from the Cheyenne people. The arrangement was practical but fragile, like a house of cards that could collapse at the slightest provocation. Izzy knew that she would have to serve as both translator and mediator, helping two vastly different cultures find common ground in the space of just 3 days. The first group consisted of a dozen cavalry scouts led by Lieutenant James Morrison, a young officer whose rigid military bearing barely concealed his nervousness. They had come to learn tracking techniques from the Cheyenne hunters, skills that could mean the difference between life and death in the unforgiving wilderness of the Colorado Territory. "Ma'am," Morrison said as he approached Izzy, his voice carefully neutral. "The colonel has instructed me to cooperate fully with this experiment. But I want you to understand that my men and I are prepared for any treachery." "There will be no treachery," Izzy replied firmly. "These people have given their word, and their word is sacred to them. But I need you to understand that respect must be mutual. If you treat them as enemies, they will respond accordingly." She gestured toward where Kohana stood with 3 other Cheyenne warriors, their faces painted with traditional designs that told the story of their achievements and spiritual visions. To the soldiers, these markings looked like war paint, but Izzy had learned to read the subtle differences that distinguished ceremonial decoration from preparation for battle. "These men are master trackers," she continued. "They can follow a trail across solid rock, predict weather patterns from the flight of birds, and find water in places where you would swear none existed. They're willing to share this knowledge with you, but only if you approach them as students, not conquerors." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. "Very well. But the moment anything goes wrong, nothing will go wrong," Izzy said with more confidence than she felt. "Trust me." The tracking lesson began badly and grew worse. The soldiers, accustomed to following obvious trails left by shod horses and wagon wheels, struggled to understand the subtle signs that the Cheyenne hunters read as easily as printed words. Broken twigs, displaced stones, the faint scent of passage carried on the wind. All of these spoke volumes to the Indian trackers, but meant nothing to the frustrated cavalrymen. "This is impossible," Sergeant Patrick O'Brien muttered after failing for the 3rd time to identify the direction taken by a deer that had passed through the area hours earlier. How can you tell anything from a few scratches in the dirt? Kohana, who had been watching the lesson with growing concern, stepped forward. He spoke quietly to Izzy and Cheyenne, his words carrying a frustration that she understood completely. These soldiers were trying to learn with their minds instead of their hearts, analyzing instead of feeling, and the disconnect was creating barriers that threatened to derail the entire arrangement. He says you're thinking too hard, Izzy translated. Tracking isn't about logic, it's about connection. You need to become one with the land, to feel what the animals feel, to understand the rhythm of life that flows through everything. That's mystical nonsense, O'Brien replied dismissively. I need facts, evidence, something I can use in a real situation. The words had barely left his mouth when a new voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Sergeant O'Brien. The voice belonged to Private William Chun, a young soldier, who had been quietly observing the lesson from the sidelines. Permission to speak, sir. Granted, O'Brien said, clearly irritated by the interruption. Sir, I grew up in San Francisco's Chinatown, and my grandfather taught me similar techniques for reading the signs of the city, the way people moved, the subtle changes in their behavior that warned of danger or opportunity. It's not mystical, sir. It's about learning to see patterns that most people ignore. Chun stepped forward and knelt beside the tracks that had confounded the other soldiers. Look here, he said, pointing to a barely visible depression in the earth. The deer stepped. Here. But see how the earth is pressed down more on the right side. That suggests it was favoring its left leg, probably due to an old injury. And here, he moved to another spot. The spacing between the prints changes, which means it stopped to look around, probably because it sensed something that made it nervous. Kohana's expression brightened with approval, and he spoke rapidly to Izzy and Cheyenne. He says, Private Chun has the eye of a hunter, she translated. He's willing to work with him individually while the others continue their group lesson. The breakthrough came when Chun, working under Kohana's patient guidance, successfully tracked a rabbit to its burrow nearly a mile away. The other soldiers watched in amazement as the young private demonstrated techniques that seemed to blend scientific observation with an almost intuitive understanding of animal behavior. I'll be damned, O'Brien muttered, his hostility beginning to give way to grudging respect. Maybe there's something to this after all. The second day brought a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they had built. A group of soldiers had been working with the Cheyenne women to learn about indigenous plants and their medicinal properties. But one of them, a corporal named Marcus Thompson, had ignored warnings about a particularly dangerous root and had eaten it despite being told it was toxic. Thompson collapsed within minutes, his body convulsing as the poison raced through his system. His fellow soldiers immediately assumed treachery, and several drew their weapons, pointing them at the terrified Cheyenne women who had been conducting the lesson. They poisoned him, shouted Sergeant Vincent Hayes, his face red with rage. I knew this was all a trap. The situation was escalating rapidly toward violence when Izzy arrived, drawn by the commotion. She took one look at Thompson's symptoms and knew immediately what had happened. The foolish man had eaten crow's bane, a root that was clearly marked with warning symbols that he had either ignored or failed to understand. Put your weapons down, she commanded, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to channel from her connection to the spirit world. This isn't treachery, it's stupidity. Your corporal ate something he was explicitly told not to touch. You're lying. Hayes snarled. They're all savages, and you're one of them now. The accusation hit Izzy like a physical blow, but she didn't have time to respond to it. Thompson was dying, and unless she acted quickly, his death would provide the excuse that men like Hayes needed to justify the massacre they had been hoping for all along. She knelt beside the convulsing soldier and reached into her medicine bundle, withdrawing a collection of herbs and crystals that she had learned to use for healing. But as she began to work, she felt resistance, not from the poison, but from something deeper, a spiritual barrier that seemed to be blocking her connection to the healing power. "What's wrong?" Nayeli asked quietly, kneeling beside her. "Your medicine isn't working. It's the hate," Izzy replied, her voice strained with effort. "The soldiers' anger, their fear, it's creating a barrier that my healing can't penetrate. I need them to stop fighting me and start helping." She looked up at Hayes, who was still pointing his rifle at the Cheyenne women. "If you want to save your corporal's life, you need to put down that weapon and help me. Healing requires harmony, not hatred. I'm not taking orders from a traitor." Hayes replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see that Thompson was dying, and despite his prejudices, he wasn't ready to let a fellow soldier die just to prove a point. Private Chun, who had become something of a bridge between the two groups, stepped forward. "Sergeant Hayes, sir, with respect, Corporal Thompson is going to die if we don't do something. Whatever you think of Miss Wilde, she's his only chance." What followed was unlike anything the soldiers had ever witnessed. Izzy, working with Nayeli and two other Cheyenne healers, began a ceremony that seemed to draw power from the very earth itself. They formed a circle around Thompson's convulsing body, their voices rising in a chant that seemed to resonate with harmonics that touched something deep in the listeners' souls. The air around them began to shimmer with an energy that was visible to the naked eye, and sensitive individuals in the crowd began to feel a tingling sensation that seemed to flow through their entire bodies. The Cheyenne participants moved with practiced precision, each one contributing their own unique gifts to the collective healing effort. But the real breakthrough came when Izzy realized that the healing wouldn't work unless the soldiers themselves participated. The poison wasn't just affecting Thompson's body, it was a manifestation of the spiritual toxin that had been poisoning the relationship between the two peoples for generations. "I need your help," she said to the watching soldiers, her voice carrying a desperation that cut through their skepticism. "Not just your permission, but your active participation. This man is dying because of the hatred between our peoples, and only by working together can we save him. What do you want us to do?" Shun asked, his voice filled with genuine concern for his fellow soldier. "Form a circle around us," Izzy replied. "Link hands with each other and with the Cheyenne healers. Let go of your fear, your anger, your prejudice. Focus only on the desire to heal, to save a life, to bridge the gap between our worlds." The request was met with initial resistance, but as Thompson's convulsions grew more violent, even the most skeptical soldiers began to understand that conventional medicine had nothing to offer in this situation. Slowly, reluctantly, they began to comply the moment the circle was complete. The change was immediate and dramatic. The shimmering energy that had been surrounding the healer suddenly expanded to encompass the entire group, and Thompson's convulsions began to subside. The poison that had been racing through his system seemed to slow, then stop, then actually begin to reverse its effects. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Morrison, who had arrived just in time to witness the healing. "What is this?" "This is what becomes possible when people stop seeing each other as enemies," Izzy replied, her voice filled with wonder at what they had accomplished together. "This is the power of unity, of cooperation, of love conquering fear." Thompson's eyes fluttered open, and he looked around at the circle of faces surrounding him, both white and Indian, all focused on his recovery. "What happened?" he asked weakly. "You were poisoned," Izzy explained gently, "but you're going to be fine now. We healed you, all of us together." The healing ceremony marked a turning point in the relationship between the soldiers and the Cheyenne people. Men who had approached the village with suspicion and hostility found themselves genuinely curious about the culture they had been taught to despise. The barriers of prejudice began to crumble as they witnessed firsthand the wisdom, compassion, and spiritual power of their supposed enemies. Private Chun, who had shown such aptitude for tracking, asked permission to spend the night in the village so he could learn more about Cheyenne hunting techniques. Sergeant O'Brien, his earlier hostility replaced by grudging respect, began learning basic words in the Cheyenne language so he could communicate more effectively with his teachers. But the most dramatic transformation was in Sergeant Hayes, the man who had been so quick to assume treachery. After witnessing the healing ceremony, he approached Izzy with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I've been a fool. These people, they're not what I thought they were. They're exactly what they've always been," Izzy replied gently. "The only thing that's changed is your willingness to see them clearly." Hayes nodded, then did something that shocked everyone present. He walked over to Nayeli, the Cheyenne woman he had threatened with his rifle just hours earlier, and extended his hand in friendship. "I'm sorry," he said in halting Cheyenne, using words that Chun had taught him. "I was wrong." Nayeli studied his face for a long moment, then smiled and took his hand. "We all make mistakes," she replied in English. "The important thing is that we learn from them." As the third day dawned, the atmosphere in the village had completely changed. Soldiers and Indians worked side by side, sharing knowledge and skills that had been developed over centuries of adaptation to the harsh frontier environment. The cavalry scouts were learning to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, while the Cheyenne hunters were discovering the advantages of military organization and equipment. But perhaps the most significant development was the growing relationship between Izzy and Kohana. The crisis had revealed depths of strength and wisdom in both of them that neither had fully understood before. They moved together with an almost telepathic understanding, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's needs, creating a partnership that seemed to transcend the boundaries of culture and race. "You've changed," Kohana said as they walked together through the village on the final evening. "When I first rescued you, you were strong but brittle, like a blade that might shatter under too much pressure. Now you're like the willow tree, flexible, resilient, able to bend without breaking." "You've changed too," Izzy replied. "You're still a warrior, but now you're also a teacher, a healer, a bridge between worlds. You found a way to fight for your people without destroying your enemies." They paused beside the central fire, where soldiers and Cheyenne were sharing stories and songs, their voices blending in harmonies that seemed to echo the music of the spheres. The sight filled Izzy with a profound sense of accomplishment, but also with a growing awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "When Colonel Steele returns and has to make his final decision?" "That depends on us," Kohana replied. "We've shown that cooperation is possible, but we haven't yet proven that it's sustainable. The real test is just beginning." Colonel Steele returned on the morning of the fourth day, his face unreadable as he surveyed the transformed camp. The rigid military discipline that had characterized his force just days earlier had given way to something more fluid, more organic. His soldiers moved with new confidence, their eyes alert to details they had never noticed before, their posture reflecting the connection to the land that hadn't been there when they arrived. "Report," he commanded as Lieutenant Morrison approached. "Sir." "The experiment has exceeded all expectations," Morrison replied. "The men have learned tracking techniques that will revolutionize our scouting operations, medical knowledge that could save countless lives, and survival skills that will make them far more effective in frontier conditions." "And the Indians?" "They've learned military organization, advanced weapons maintenance, and strategic thinking that will help them defend their territory more effectively. But more importantly, sir, they've shown us that they're not the savages we thought they were. They're people intelligent, skilled, spiritual people who have much to offer if we're willing to learn from them." Steele's expression remained neutral, but Izzy could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was a career soldier, trained to think in terms of objectives and results, and the results he was seeing challenged everything he thought he knew about Indian-white relations. "The question remains," he said finally, "whether this cooperation can be sustained over time. It's one thing to work together for 3 days under ideal conditions. It's another to maintain an alliance when resources are scarce, when political pressure mounts, when the inevitable conflicts arise. There's only one way to find out, Izzy said, stepping forward. Give us a chance to prove that it can work. Not just for 3 days, but for 3 months, 3 years, however long it takes to build something lasting. The colonel studied her face, noting the transformation that had taken place in her as well. The frightened schoolteacher who had faced the gallows in Dustbrook was gone, replaced by a woman who radiated confidence and spiritual power. Very well, he said finally. I'm prepared to recommend to my superiors that this village be granted special status as a cooperative territory. But understand this is an experiment, not a permanent arrangement. The moment it stops working, the moment there's any sign of betrayal or violence, the original orders will be reinstated. Understood, Izzy replied. But I don't think you'll be disappointed. What we've started here isn't just cooperation, it's evolution. We're creating something new, something that neither of our peoples has ever seen before. As the sun set over the Colorado Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Izzy felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle over her. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. They had proven that cooperation was possible, but now they had to prove that it was sustainable. The future stretched before them, filled with challenges and opportunities that none of them could fully imagine. But for the first time since she had arrived in the West, Izzy felt truly optimistic about what that future might hold. 6 months had passed since Colonel Steele's groundbreaking decision to establish the cooperative territory, and the experiment had flourished beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The Cheyenne village had transformed into a thriving center of cultural exchange, where soldiers and Indians worked side by side in perfect harmony. Trading posts had been established, medical clinics operated jointly by white doctors and Cheyenne. Healers served both communities, and children of both races played together in the meadows that surrounded the settlement. But on this crisp November morning, all of that was about to change. A lone rider approached the village at a gallop, his horse foam-flecked and exhausted from what had clearly been a desperate journey. The man himself was barely recognizable, his uniform torn, his face gaunt with hunger and desperation. It was Captain Theodore Whitman, one of Colonel Steele's most trusted officers, and the news he carried would shatter the fragile peace that had taken so long to build. "Miss Wilde," he called out as he stumbled from his horse, his voice cracking with exhaustion and grief. "I have to warn you, they're coming." General Harrison received word about the cooperative territory, and he's furious. He's branded Colonel Steele a traitor and ordered his immediate arrest. Izzy felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of Whitman's words sank in. General Marcus Harrison was known throughout the frontier as a man who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and the cooperative territory represented everything he despised about modern military policy. "Where is Colonel Steele now?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Dead," Whitman replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Shot down under a flag of truce when he tried to explain the success of the program. Harrison has 3,000 troops marching this way, and he's given orders to burn the village and execute every Indian they find. The news spread through the village like wildfire, and within minutes the peaceful settlement was transformed into a hive of desperate activity. Families began packing their most precious possessions. Warriors checked their weapons, and the elders gathered in urgent council to decide the fate of their people. "We have to run," Nayeli said, her voice tight with fear as she cradled her newborn daughter. "Take the children and disappear into the deep mountains until this storm passes." "There's nowhere to run," Kohana replied grimly. "Harrison has troops positioned at every mountain pass, every river crossing. He's planned this carefully. We're surrounded," Ayana Wind whisper, now ancient beyond measure, but still sharp as a blade, raised her voice above the growing panic. "There is another way," she said, her words carrying the weight of prophecy. "But it will require a sacrifice that may be too great for any of us to bear." All eyes turned to the old woman, who sat wrapped in her ceremonial robes with an expression of infinite sadness. "The spirits have shown me a vision," she continued. "One person must go to Harrison, must offer themselves as a hostage to buy time for the others to escape. But this person will not return. They will die so that the people might live." The village fell silent as the weight of her words settled over them. Everyone understood what she was saying. Someone would have to walk into certain death to save the rest. "I'll go," Kohana said immediately, but Ayana shook her head. "No, my grandson. Your path lies elsewhere. The spirits have chosen another." For this sacrifice, her ancient eyes fixed on Izzy, and suddenly everyone understood. The white woman who had become their bridge between worlds would have to return to that world one final time, not as a teacher or healer, but as a sacrifice to appease the hatred that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The decision was made with the grim efficiency of people who had learned to face death with dignity. Izzy would ride out to meet Harrison's army, would offer herself as the primary instigator of the cooperative territory, and would buy time for the village to evacuate into the sacred lands where the soldiers would not follow, as she prepared for what everyone knew would be her final journey. Izzy felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. She had found her true purpose in this place, had discovered powers within herself that she never knew existed, and had helped create something beautiful and lasting. If her death could preserve that legacy, then it was a price worth paying. Kohana appeared beside her as she saddled her horse, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Let me come with you, let me fight beside you. Your place is with your people," Izzy replied gently. "You're their leader now, their protector. They need you to survive, to carry on the work we started." She reached into her medicine bundle and withdrew the crystal that Ayana had given her months ago, the one that had helped her discover her healing powers. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing it into his hands. "So you'll always remember that love is stronger than hatred, that hope can triumph over despair." Kohana's composure finally cracked, and he pulled her into his arms with desperate intensity. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you on that platform, willing to die for what you believed in." "I love you too," Izzy replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "In this life and in whatever comes after, we'll find each other again. I promise." They held each other as the sun began to set. Two souls who had found perfect unity in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. Around them, the village continued its preparations for evacuation, but for this moment, nothing existed except their love and their grief. As darkness fell over the Colorado territory, Izzy mounted her horse and began the ride that would take her to her destiny. Behind her, the village was already beginning to disperse, families melting into the wilderness with the silent efficiency of people who had learned to survive against impossible odds. She rode through the night, her heart heavy with sorrow but also filled with a strange kind of triumph. She had lived more fully in the past year than in all the years that had come before, had discovered depths of courage and compassion that she never knew she possessed, had helped create something that would outlast her own brief existence. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, she could see the dust cloud on the horizon that marked the approach of Harrison's army. 3,000 soldiers marching toward what they believed would be a simple massacre, not knowing that they were about to encounter a woman who had learned to channel the very forces of life itself. She had no illusions about the outcome of the confrontation that lay ahead. Harrison would have her killed, probably after subjecting her to public humiliation and torture. But her death would buy time for the people she loved, would allow them to escape into the sacred lands, where they could preserve the culture and wisdom that she had come to cherish. The sun rose higher, and in its light, Izzy could see the glint of bayonets and the flutter of regimental flags. The army was close now, close enough that she could hear the thunder of hooves and the shouted commands of officers. This was it, the moment of truth, the final test of everything she had learned and become. She straightened in her saddle, her head held high with the same defiant pride that had carried her through the ordeal of the gallows so many months ago. She was no longer just Isadora Wilde, the schoolteacher from Boston. She was a medicine woman, a bridge between worlds, a woman who had learned to love without boundaries and fight without hatred. The army crested the hill ahead of her, and she rode forward to meet her fate with courage that would echo through. The age's General Marcus Harrison was a man forged in the fires of hatred, his scarred face a testament to decades of frontier warfare. He sat astride his black stallion like a monument to military might, his 3,000 troops arranged in perfect formation behind him. When he saw the lone woman riding toward his army, his lips curled into a cruel smile. "So," he called out. As Izzy approached under a white flag, "The famous Indian lover has come to surrender. How appropriate that a traitor should die crawling on her belly." "I've come to negotiate," Izzy replied, her voice steady despite the terror that gripped her heart. "Your quarrel is with me, not with the innocent people in that village. Let them go, and I'll submit to whatever punishment you deem fit." Harrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Negotiate? You think you're in a position to negotiate? You've corrupted good soldiers with your savage ways, turned them against their own kind. The only negotiation you'll get is how quickly you want to die." But even as he spoke, something strange was happening. The crystal that Kohana had given her was growing warm against her chest, and she could feel the familiar stirring of power that had become her greatest gift. The morning air began to shimmer, with an energy that made the horses dance nervously and the soldiers mutter uneasily among themselves. "You're afraid," Izzy said, her voice beginning to carry harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. "You're afraid because you know that what we've built in that village represents the future, and you can't stop the future with bullets and bayonets. I'm not afraid of a deluded woman who thinks she can talk to spirits." Harrison snarled, but his horse was backing away from her now, its eyes rolling with terror at something it could sense but not understand. "Then let me show you what those spirits can do," Izzy said, and her voice was no longer entirely her own. It carried the wisdom of Ayana, the strength of Kohana, the love of all the people who had accepted her as family. She was no longer just one woman, she was the voice of two worlds speaking as one. What happened next would be debated by historians for generations, though those who witnessed it would never forget the terror and wonder of that moment. Izzy raised her hands toward the sky, and the crystal around her neck began to glow with an inner fire that seemed to draw power from the very earth itself. The ground beneath the army began to tremble, not with the violence of an earthquake but with the steady pulse of a great heartbeat. The horses reared and plunged, their riders struggling to maintain control as an invisible force seemed to wash over them in waves. Some of the soldiers began to weep, overwhelmed by visions of the families they had destroyed, the children they had orphaned, the cultures they had helped to annihilate. "Stop this!" Harrison screamed, drawing his pistol and pointing it at Izzy. "Stop this now, or I'll—" But his words were cut short as the weapon simply crumbled to dust in his hands. The same force that was affecting his men was working on their equipment as well, causing rifles to jam, sabers to dull, and ammunition to scatter like sand in the wind. "You can't stop truth with violence," Izzy said, her voice now carrying the power of storm winds and rushing rivers. "You can't kill an idea whose time has come. The world is changing, General, and you can either change with it or be swept away by it." Around her, the very air seemed to be alive with the spirits of all those who had died in the endless cycle of frontier violence. Indian warriors and cavalry soldiers, settlers and native children, all of them united in their desire to see the killing finally end. They reached out with ghostly hands to touch the hearts of the living soldiers, showing them visions of what the world could become. If hatred gave way to understanding, one by one, the soldiers began to lay down their weapons. It started with the youngest recruits, boys who had not yet had their hearts completely hardened by years of warfare. But soon it spread to the sergeants, the lieutenants, even the battle-scarred veterans who had thought they were beyond redemption. "No!" Harrison screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're soldiers. You follow orders. You don't surrender to superstitious nonsense." But his words fell on deaf ears. The miracle was spreading through the ranks like wildfire, and even his most trusted officers were beginning to see the futility of their mission. How could they fight against an enemy who offered not violence but healing, not conquest but cooperation? As the sun reached its zenith, the transformation was complete. 3,000 soldiers who had marched out that morning, prepared to commit genocide, now stood with bowed heads, their weapons piled at their feet like offerings to a greater power. The air itself seemed cleansed, as if the very atmosphere had been purged of the hatred and fear that had poisoned it for so long. General Harrison stood alone in the center of his defeated army, his face a mask of bewilderment and rage. "This isn't over," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "There will be others, other armies, other generals who won't be fooled by your tricks." "Perhaps," Izzy replied, her voice gentle now, filled with compassion even for this man who had come to destroy everything she loved. "But every time they come, they'll find people like us standing against them. People who believe that love is stronger than hate, that understanding can triumph over ignorance, that the future belongs to those who build bridges instead of walls." She gestured toward the village, where smoke was rising from the cooking fires as families began to return from their hiding places. "Look at what we've built," she continued. "Look at what becomes possible when people choose cooperation over conflict. That's our legacy, General. That's what will outlast all of us." Harrison's shoulders sagged as the weight of his defeat settled over him. He was a career soldier, trained to win at any cost. But how could he fight against an enemy who had already won the hearts of his own men? "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice hollow with despair. "I want you to go back to Washington," Izzy said. "I want you to tell them what you've seen here. Tell them that the frontier doesn't have to be a battleground, that two peoples can live together in peace if they're willing to try." As the defeated army began its long march back to the east, Izzy stood alone on the prairie, watching the sun set over the Colorado Territory. The crisis had passed, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. They had won a victory, but victories were fragile things that had to be defended every day. Kohana appeared beside her, his face glowing with pride and wonder. "You did it," he said simply. "You actually did it. We did it," Izzy corrected. "All of us together. The village, the spirits, the power of love itself." She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw not just the woman he loved, but the medicine woman who had learned to channel the very forces of creation. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build," Kohana replied. "We build a world where children can grow up without fear, where knowledge flows freely between all peoples, where the color of a person's skin matters less than the content of their heart." They walked back toward the village together, hand in hand, two souls who had found perfect unity in a world that had tried to tear them apart. Behind them, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and ahead of them lay a future filled with infinite possibility. The schoolteacher from Boston was gone, replaced by something far more powerful, a medicine woman who had learned to heal not just bodies, but the wounds that divided entire peoples. She had started her journey condemned to die for her beliefs, but she had ended it as a bridge between worlds, a living symbol of what becomes possible when love conquers fear. They called him wild, but she called him beloved, and together, they would build a legacy that would echo through the ages, a testament to the power of love to transform even the darkest corners of the human heart.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.